morning. Firstly, a huge thank you to all of you who took part in the All In Census. Finding out who makes up our workforce is the vital first stage of the industry's All In campaign to ensure that everyone who works in UK advertising feels they belong. This first ever industry-wide survey is a collaboration between AA, IPA and ISBA in partnership with Kantar and was completed by individuals from creative, media and marketing agencies, media owners, tech platforms and production companies, making it a brilliant snapshot of the whole industry landscape. We created a Stop the Clock on March the 10th, and over 16,000 of us made time to complete the survey, which we estimate is an investment of £500,000 of industry time. We also shared that we were all in, which prompted an unmissable tidal wave of support across social channels. And to illustrate just how all in we were, the census was trending at #1 on Twitter in London that morning, a major achievement in a week that saw the royal interview and Piers Morgan leaving GMB. This first data set of the whole industry gives us the evidence to determine the most important part of this work, the industry's action plan, which outlines our initial areas of focus and some very clear calls to action. I'll tell you more about that a little later, but now I'm going to hand over to Amy Cashman, Managing Director of Insights Division UK and Ireland at Kantar, to reveal the findings.
Thanks, Sharon. And yeah, absolutely. That's such an enormous sample size. It's been a great response from the industry. And one of the really fantastic things about that is it means that we can really cover in depth a lot of different groups within the study. And obviously with the purpose of this being about inclusion and diversity, it's fantastic to see, and you can see on this slide, the types of areas that we can cover through having such a comprehensive sample size. And these are some of the areas that I'm going to touch on now, actually, for the next sort of 10-15 minutes as I take you through the key learnings from the study. So I'm going to start with gender representation. And what we saw in the sample was we did have slightly more women responding than men. But when we looked into the position of those women in their organisations, we actually saw a kind of reversal. So we saw a significantly higher proportion of men in C-suite positions than we did women. And I think that's in line with what we would expect, given what we see in this industry and indeed other industries. But I think it is worth just mentioning that because one of the other things that we were able to look at through the study was what we call the stated gender pay gap. And what we mean by that is we asked people to say what their salary was, and we obviously had their level within the organisation. And from that, we were able to get to a stated gender pay gap. And what you see with this data is how the widening of that pay gap as we move up the echelons of an organisation. And part of that is obviously driven by the fact that we see more men in senior positions in the industry. But interestingly, one of the other things we saw was that we were thinking again about women's progression to being more senior and what could be the blockages stopping that happening. We actually, when we asked women whether they felt parental leave had disadvantaged their career, we saw over half of them actually did feel it had. And so it's obviously a very key milestone on any woman's journey through her career, but one we certainly think is having an impact here why we don't potentially see more women in senior positions in the industry. I want to talk about the area of gender discrimination harassment because actually, and it kind of links, I suppose, to the point I was making on the previous chart, we certainly see higher levels of claimed sexual discrimination by women versus men. In terms of sexual harassment, however, we've seen very low levels recorded in the study. Now, it's obviously interesting to reflect on the fact we've done this study whilst the majority of people are working from home, and that will have had an impact for sure. We know there are obviously campaigns that have been happening in the industry too around tackling this issue, but we feel this is one of these that we need to keep an eye on in future research as perhaps people come back to office working and people are in closer proximity to one another. So when we look at this kind of research again in the future. I want to turn now to the area of ethnicity, representation of different ethnic groups. And I think there's a couple of interesting points to make here. We've looked at it in terms of people who are Black and also people who identify as Asian. And what you see is, whilst as an industry we're not necessarily out of line with the UK population, when we start looking at the London working population, it is a slightly different story. And I think, London is very much the epicentre of our industry in Britain. And so that is a very fair comparison to make. And I think the other point is that when we look into the more senior positions, those C-suite positions, again, we don't see the levels of representation being in line with either expectations, with the expectations of the London working population. So it kind of talks to an issue around how well we do have levels of ethnic representation in the industry. And one of the challenges around this that we kind of wanted to call out from the research as well was both the level of discrimination that people from these different ethnic backgrounds feel, and you can see in the navy blue bar here a very significant difference compared to the levels indicated by white people, but also the impact that people feel that might have on their likelihood of leaving the industry in the future. And that's really quite high level, sort of between 1 in 3 down to 1 in 4 of people claiming that that would have an impact on them. And obviously, as we talk about how we get more senior people from different backgrounds in the industry, the fact that we might be losing people along the way is really quite a concern, and something that definitely needs further investigation. Turning now to the area of disability, what we see is that disabled people certainly are underrepresented. So 9% in the industry survey here versus 20% in the work population. And again, even more, only 6% at sea level. So there's definitely an issue around representation. However, interestingly, when we asked people how they felt about support from their company, actually almost 3/4 of disabled people felt they were supported by their company. That said, we also asked, and about half of them felt there was still more that could be done. So it was more kind of a base level of support they felt they were gaining. And again, to the point about inclusion and keeping people and helping them progress their careers, almost a quarter of people with disabilities were feeling that they might be likely to leave their organisation because they weren't necessarily getting that feeling of inclusion and support that they needed. One of the other very interesting issues we've been able to look at is around social mobility. And we've looked at that from a couple of different angles, actually. So one of the first pieces of data to share is around the representation of people from a working class background in the industry. And that's quite a lot smaller. So 19% in the industry versus 39% in the wider working population. And also another interesting metric to look alongside that is around the percentage of people who attended a fee-paying school. And again, it's actually much higher in the industry, 20% versus 8% in the general population. And I think when we think about the industry and the role it plays in representing brands and products to consumers, obviously having a good representation of people from all walks of life and backgrounds, those people being the ones who work on those representations of brands and products, is really critical. So this is a really interesting area to explore, I think. And one of the things that we wanted to just sort of highlight that came from the data also, which I think very strongly links to this, is the very much higher proportion of people in the industry who are graduates versus the working population. And of course, this is linked, being a graduate is linked to other elements that we've already talked about in terms of, working class background and things like that. So I think there's some interesting things there around the reliance of the industry on graduates as a source of talent. Thinking about things like apprenticeships and paid internships, which I know many organisations within the industry are already exploring, but using those as a way to get at a wider and more diverse pool of talent for the industry. On the topic of sexual orientation, actually a very positive set of results. In our sample, we had 10% of respondents identifying as LGBTQ+, and that's higher than the UK average. And actually, when we look at people in the C-suite, sort of in line as well. So it was getting the sense that these people have been able to progress through their organisation to the higher levels as well. And actually as well, in terms of feeling like, it's an inclusive place where you can prosper, we definitely have seen lower levels of personal discrimination due to sexual orientation in the industry versus the national average, which is a benchmark that we have within Kantar. So these are actually really quite positive results. Turning to age, and I know there's been quite a lot of commentary in the industry about age and around that as an inclusion variable for the industry to consider. And what we see here, the navy blue bar is representing the proportion of people in our data that came from different age groups, and the white line shows you the UK working population. So you can see the industry skews very much younger. And what's interesting is that those younger groups tend to be more diverse. So we see an increase as the people get older in the industry of it being white male background. But interestingly as well, those people in some of the older age groups are more likely to say that they have felt personally discriminated against because of their age. So while there seems to be more diversity linked to the younger age groups, those in the sort of 55 to 64 age bracket in particular do feel they have experience of personal discrimination due to their age. We also wanted to look at religion as obviously a key topic. About half the sample felt they didn't have a religion, and then the rest was quite well sort of spread across the other religions that one would expect to see here in Britain, in modern Britain. But what's interesting when we look specifically into the next chart at Muslims, Hindus and Sikhs, sadly they are more likely to feel that they are going to leave the industry in the future due to a lack of inclusion and or discrimination. And that's quite a, 1 in 3 of the Muslims that we interviewed, down to sort of 1 in 5, 1 in 4 of the Sikh people that we interviewed. And again, I think this talks to the challenge of getting people from different ethnic backgrounds in particular to more senior levels in the industry, because obviously people are not feeling that sense of inclusion. It's very hard to stay in an organisation when you don't feel included, and that goes for the industry writ large. Wanted to touch on mental health as well, which was obviously an important topic that we covered in the study. Again, I will remind us obviously all that we've been in a global pandemic, and that has really, we know, affected people's mental health in the last sort of 18 months. But we've seen around a third of respondents in our survey saying that they do feel they have felt stressed or anxious, and that is a high proportion of people. And I think what we've tried to do on the right hand side of the slide is call out some of the groups who particularly have felt that and found that quite, pronounced particularly. And I would call out specifically the 25 to 34-year-old age group, where 38% of people have claimed to feel stressed or anxious, because they are actually such a large part of the population. That does have a bit of a disproportionate impact in terms of the numbers of people feeling stressed and anxious. Obviously, one of the important aspects of this whole topic area is how people feel they are able to call out discrimination they may be seeing. And it's a really important part of whether or not people feel genuinely included and like they belong in organisations. So what we asked about how people felt about reporting discrimination they'd observed against others. Around 8% of people felt they could do that. But that drops to around 26% when it's about discrimination that affects you personally. And there's something interesting in that about people feeling perhaps more able to intervene for others than they feel themselves, possibly because of the impact that discrimination has had on them personally. But when we look at why people aren't reporting, actually there is still clearly a bit of a concern around the impact it could have on career. So 53% of people felt that could be a negative impact for them. And for 27% of people, it was because actually the person who'd been involved was a senior leader. And then, of course, this comes back to the sort of circular point about how we want to get more people into senior positions from a variety of different backgrounds in a way to kind of improve inclusion and diversity and hopefully improve understanding of other backgrounds and cultures and in time reduce discrimination. So there's plenty there, obviously, for us to think about, lots of food for thought. Again, I would say been brilliant to see the level of response from the industry. I'm going to hand back now to Sharon, who is going to talk a bit more about the action plans that will be taken on the back of these results.
Thank you, Amy. As you've just seen, we now have some powerful data on which to act. And as I mentioned, action is the vital component of the All In campaign. The All In Action Plan has been developed using the evidence we gathered, essentially your voices. But it's important to emphasise this is very much volume one of an evolving plan. There are many things for us to address, but we think will make more impact if the industry as a whole tackles a few at a time. Action one is to improve the experience and representation of Black talent. The data shows that there is a lot of work to be done for those from all minority ethnic backgrounds, but we recognise that different challenges arise for each group, and so we will look at them separately. But we saw that 32% of Black people are likely to leave the industry, and we need to address that now. Our call to action is to download and adopt the BRIM framework. BRIM, which stands for Black Representation in Marketing, is accessible to all of us, no matter what our role or where our organisation is regarding inclusion. It's a framework full of tools and resources to ensure positive action for Black talent in our workforce, the networks we work with, and in the advertising we produce. It's a fantastic end-to-end solution, as it also includes tracking to measure success. Action 2 is to improve the experience and representation of disabled talent. We saw that we underrepresent with only 9% identifying as disabled versus 20% of the UK working population. Our first call to action to support disabled talent is to audit your company website and ensure that it's accessible to all. A staggeringly low number of commercial websites comply with the latest international standards, and that means that the 10 million people in the UK who have usability needs online are unable to access them. Not only will it ensure that this talent can access your company's site, it also signals that as an industry, this really matters to us. Something that most of us take for granted will be a game changer for some of our current and potential colleagues. Action 3 is to improve the experience and representation of working class talent. Again, this group is massively underrepresented at just 19% versus 39% of the UK working population. Our call to action is to adopt the Social Mobility Commission's toolkit. A version of this for the creative industries is being launched later this month. And like BRIM, it includes resources and training for organisations. These three actions may seem simple, but by galvanising the reach of AA, IPA and ISBAR members to all do all three things, we can make the significant progress that we need to, one step at a time. We will in turn focus on all the other themes that came out of the data. Throughout the morning, you will hear about each action in more depth, and we'll be measuring this too, while we introduce further actions, so that when we repeat the All In Census in 2023, we will have made a positive impact. You can find details of the findings, the action plan, and all the resources you need on the All In Hub at the address on screen. The Hub hopes to provide industry with a one-stop shop of all the amazing initiatives that recruit, support, and advance diverse talent, as well as the details of the evolving action plan. It's important to us that we're not reinventing the wheel, but amplifying what there is already. The pandemic has given us all an opportunity to learn more about each other as human beings, and to learn how we can work and communicate in new ways. This is the perfect time for the industry to act together and create the workplace where we all feel we belong.